Wouldn't it be nice to have several thought leaders in your industry know and love your brand? Start a podcast. Invite your industry's thought leaders to be guests on your show and start reaping the benefits of having a network full of industry influencers. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to the B2B Growth Show, a podcast dedicated to helping B2B executives achieve explosive growth. Whether you're looking for techniques and strategies or tools and resources, you've come to the right place. I'm Jonathan Green.
And I'm James Carberry.
Let's get into the show. Welcome back to the B2B Growth Show. Today we are joined by Blair Enns. Blair is the CEO of Win Without Pitching. He's also the author of the Win Without Pitching Manifesto. Blair, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jonathan. My pleasure to be here.
Well, it's my pleasure. You had sent me the manifesto a few weeks ago, and I've had a chance to sort of dive into it, and there's some great lessons in this book. But kind of, you'd obviously be able to talk about it better than I ever could. So maybe you can tell our listeners a little about, Win Without Pitching, what you and your team are up to, and kind of what this manifesto is about.
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm a recovering consultant. I'm a recovering business development consultant to creative firms, independent creative firms. So ad agencies, design firms, public relations practices, and a bunch of kind of like similarly related businesses where the business is selling ideas and advice. And recovering consultant because about 4 years ago, I shifted the business from that of a solo consulting practice to a scaled up training company. And there's a bunch of different reasons I did that. But the audience remains the same. I work with, and my team, we work with owners of independent creative businesses to help them get better at getting new clients. So we use the term new business development as a shield or a facade for really sales and marketing and some other things around that. But in the creative professions, we don't like to use the S word. In fact, if I send an email to my list of about 13,000 people in the creative professions, and I include the S word in the subject line, the open rate goes way down. So I'm happy to talk about, because we need to say what it is. It is selling. And I'm happy to talk about that in the article itself, but I've learned to not put it in the subject line. So it's an interesting tidbit about the creative professions.
No, very interesting, because it is something that everyone even in the creative profession deals with. But like you said, there's a power behind that word. But you do work with a lot of creative agencies, and I think that really speaks to why we wanted to get you on the show today to talk about this idea of how to hire the right creative agency. We have a lot of listeners who are marketing executives, and oftentimes they are faced with this choice, with this question. There's a lot of missteps that they can make. So let's just dive into it. Let's talk about how to hire the right creative agency and where that starts.
Yeah, and I appreciate the opportunity to do this because I've been advising creative firms for, it's like 15, 16 years now, first as a consultant and second as the owner of a training company. And I rarely get the opportunity to turn around and face the client side about how to go about hiring a firm. And I'm usually talking, there's so many bad practices that are so highly ingrained in both the client side and the agency side of how to hire a creative firm. And even most of the solutions that I see, like kind of the alternative approaches that I see that are coming out of the creative professions, like design associations around the world, so many of them publish guidance on how clients should hire a creative firm. And I'm almost without exception, they're ridiculous. Like they're imposing these unfair constraints on the client. And the clients don't spend a second thinking about these documents. These organizations have no sway with the clients on how a client should hire an agency. So they have these radical ideas of how the client might protect the creative professions from the basic underlying problem that there is a significant oversupply of undifferentiated creative firms. So these design associations and some advertising associations, they're trying to impose these rules on the client side of the relationship, but the problem is really on the agency side. And so the fundamental problem of why new business development or sales from an agency point of view is so hard is that there's so many Me Too firms. There are so many firms that do exactly what other firms do, and it's really hard for the client to tell one from the other. So therefore, the client has all the power in the buy-sell relationship. And I'm always saying this to my clients, like you have no power, and the first step to becoming a better salesperson is to actually fundamentally changing what it is that you as a firm do. So you need to narrow your focus, build deeper expertise, set yourself apart from your competitors, and then you have more power in the buy-sell relationship to push back on kind of what I often see as arduous or even flawed and sometimes outright ridiculous selection processes. So that's the guidance that I typically give to creative firms about you start with power and then build a more meaningfully differentiated firm, and then you can change the way that you sell. And if you're not seen as meaningfully different, then it's really hard to change the way you sell. You're always going to have to pitch for free, to give your ideas away for free, your most valuable product. But once you're seen as meaningfully different, then maybe you can push back. And so from the client's point of view, when I'm telling agencies to push back on how you would hire them, what I'm really asking them to do is to gauge through some actions in the sale to gauge how meaningfully different you see them to be, you, the client. And my advice to the agency is if the client sees you as meaningfully different, then you take a step forward. So the client, we talk about the pitch, and my business and my book is built around this idea of the pitch, where the client sends out an RFP and maybe lines up 4 or 40 different firms and says, here's our challenge, give me your best ideas, and we're going to hire the people with the best ideas. That's the problem that I'm really trying to solve among my client base. But again, the problem is really, it's just a symptom of a greater problem, of a collection of greater problems. And that primary problem that it's a symptom of is the fact that you're just not different enough. So what can you do on the client side when you're trying to hire a firm? Well, you could do this pitch. You could do this kind of cattle call and throw it out to as many firms as possible. But there's some challenges with that. The first one, probably the thing that I dislike most about how clients and professional firms of any kind come together is the RFP. I think the request for proposal is the most ridiculous process going. And I would say to clients, there's a far better approach to hiring an agency than beginning with an RFP. Because an RFP basically throws it wide open and says, here's what we're looking for. We're self-diagnosed, we're self-prescribed, here's what we want, give us your best price. That's effectively what you're trying to do through the RFP process. Now, in the United States, when the federal government or most of the states are involved in procuring something now, they're no longer allowed to use an RFP process. They have to use a QBS, or qualification-based system, which essentially says, here's the project that we're looking to do. And even when you scope out the project, you want to leave room for the outside expert to come in and think about the situation differently. So that's point number one, is whatever your kind of request for proposal or the request for the agency to state their intent on working with you, whatever it is, you want to leave room for them to diagnose and prescribe, or at least to validate your own assessment of your situation, especially with creative firms, because their strength is seeing the problem differently. So when you construct an RFP that says, here's our problem, here's a solution, what's your cost for the solution, you are taking away their best ability to help you. So number one, whatever selection process you're using, you want to allow the client to bring their creative powers to bear. Number two, tell them what the price is. Tell them what the price is, and then ask them to come up with even a price range, and then ask them to come up with, explain essentially, well, not even explain, just say, here's the challenge, here's the budget range, now let's have a conversation about how you might go about this. Mm-hmm. And don't ask them to do a whole bunch of work, put it into paper, lob a bunch of ideas over the fence, because the history is quite clear. The work that gets created, it's just such a waste of resources on the client side and the agency side. And there's a great video, TED Talk by a friend and a colleague named Cal Harrison, who talks about the waste in the RFP process versus the QBS, qualification-based selection. But it's rife with waste. So if you just say, here's what we think our challenge is, here are the scopes of solutions we're looking for, here are the qualifications we want in a firm, and then here's the price range they're thinking about. Use that as a simple document and allow people to respond simply with maybe a page or two and then a conversation. So in the Win Without Pitching manifesto, one of the proclamations or chapters is that we will replace, and again, this is coming back from the agency side, we will replace presentations with conversations. For reasons I won't get into here, creative people are addicted to the presentation. And I think the client would do well and do a better job of hiring the right firm if they could break down let's get everybody out of the presentation business. Let's forget about creating all this needless paper on our end, on the agency's end. Let's get like the basics of everything into, as little paper as possible in terms of what you're sending out, what you're asking people to send back, and then let's get to conversations as quickly as possible. I think if you can do that, if you just did that, if you just said less paper, more conversations, but you need to know what you're looking for in the conversation, so you're framing, here's how we see the challenge, here's how we see the problem, here's how we see the challenge, here's the budget we have assigned for this, here are the qualifications we need in a firm. If you meet these qualifications, let's just talk about how we've scoped this out and what the appropriate next step might be.
Yeah, and I actually remember that chapter, that proclamation, talking about getting away from presentations, focusing on conversations. I also remember the chapter or proclamation where you have talked about, and I think it speaks to this first point, allowing the agency to be creative, in that you're not self-diagnosing when you come with a problem. Like, this is what we want to have done, but maybe the problem, you're looking at the problem incorrectly. I think you could actually compare it at one point to a patient coming into the doctor's office and self-diagnosing. And, the doctor would have this opportunity to say, well, I know what you think you want, but here's what the real problem is. Here's what you actually want. And I think that is wrapped up in this idea, right, about allowing the agency to bring some of their creative prowess to bear on what they see as the problem.
Yeah, and even if the problem isn't different, but just allowing room for the client, for the agency to say, okay, well, your situation is interesting, but have you ever thought about this?
Yeah.
Have you ever thought about something entirely different? So you need to leave room for that when you're hiring methodology. And I would say, just as an overarching guide, don't over-paper the thing. Generally speaking, the more paper that's required to hire a creative firm, like when you're creating an RFP or some sort of like written solicitation, the more you write, the less you really understand what it is that you're looking for. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and it almost, in my mind, it's if you are writing it down, you're almost getting more into that presentation side. You're just telling instead of working together.
Yeah. And I'll also add that I think any firm, if you've got a sizable budget that you're thinking of committing to whatever your creative or your marketing partner is, then I think it makes sense for you to begin the engagement, the relationship with a small first step and a note clause at the end of that first step. So it might be some sort of ask the agency to come in and validate the problem as you've identified it and the solution that you think you want. So pay them a little bit of money to bring their kind of expert practice to bear on understanding the problem and either validating the solution or coming up with something new. So that kind of paid diagnostic, that's a really good first step. You might even ask them for a guarantee at the end of that phase, saying, if at the end of this we feel like you're not the right firm and we've made a horrible mistake and you've wasted our time, we're going to ask you for our money back. I think that's acceptable too. It's not necessary, but I think it's acceptable. So just think about, instead of like handing your entire budget over to somebody, I hired a firm recently and I wish I could have done it differently. I wish I could have taken a smaller paid step rather than handing over all of this money and then realizing at some point, you know what, I think this was a mistake. So look for a way to break it up into a manageable first step to test the fit in the working relationship first, and then have an out clause after that. If it's not the right firm, you get to move on. And maybe if it's a disaster, there's an agreement that you'll get reimbursed for the money that you handed over.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Blair, if any of our listeners are interested in finding out more about, this idea, how to hire the right creative agency, or they're on the other side, and they're interested in reading, the Win Without Pitching Manifesto, or they just want to connect with you, what's the best way for them to go about doing that?
Yeah, so I can be found at winwithoutpitching.com. I'm also Blair Enns, BLAIRENNS on Twitter and LinkedIn.
Perfect. Blair, this has been a fantastic episode. Thank you again so much for your time today.
Thanks, Jonathan. My pleasure.
To ensure that you never miss an episode of the B2B Growth Show, subscribe to the show on iTunes or your favorite podcast player. This guarantees that every episode will get delivered directly to your device.
If you or someone you know would be an incredible guest for the B2B Growth Show, email me at jonathan@sweetfishmedia.com. Let us know. We love connecting with B2B executives, and we love sharing their wisdom and perspective with our audience.
Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.